So welcome everyone to the Middle Eastern Policy Platform's webinar on the growing military influence in Egypt. We are honored to have Dr. Mohammad Fadel, professor at the University of Toronto and former Canada Research Chair for the Law and Economics of Islamic Law, as guest speaker for this event. The format of this webinar will be the talk presented by our guest speaker, Dr. Mohammad Fadel, followed by any questions from our audience. The successful passage of constitutional amendments codifying the military's power highlights a new process of instilling authoritarianism in Egypt. Article 200 affirms that the military is now able to intervene in Egyptian affairs to, quote, maintain the constitution and democracy and safeguard the basic components of the state, end of quote. In other words, the military is now able to step into the political realm whenever it pleases. Without constitutional backing, the Egyptian military has twice been involved in Egyptian political affairs in the last decade. The first was in 2011, when the military helped push Hosni Mubarak out of power, while the second time came only 2 years after, as the military overthrew Mohammad Morsi. This begs the question, as the military has been given constitutional backing to step in whenever they want, how then does this amendment benefit current President Sisi? With that, the floor is all yours, Dr. Mohammad Fadel.
Okay, well, thank you very much for hosting me here. It's interesting to think about what the purpose of these constitutional amendments enshrining an official role or granting the military an official role in governance in Egypt actually does. I mean, as you suggested in your introduction, the Egyptian military hasn't needed any kind of formal constitutional authority to intervene in political affairs. So it's done that repeatedly in Egyptian history, in modern Egyptian history, most notably in the Free Officers' Coup that created this current regime, and then again in 2011 and 2013. And so the new sort of constitutional amendments, in a sense, are just simply a recognition of the status quo of Egyptian politics for the last 70 years. So I don't personally think they represent anything more than stating what has been an obvious fact for a couple of generations in Egyptian politics right now, namely that the military is the effective ruler of Egypt. I think that the main question is, why is this the case, and whether or not this will continue in the future, and why was it able to intervene in 2013 to its own advantage? I think the main lesson to be learned here is that the military has been very effective because of the disarray of, lack of a better term, civil society. Civil society has not shown itself to be capable of expressing coherent political positions that all major members of civil society are willing to defend. This was exhibited in the monarchist period by the complete incapacity of Egyptian political parties to function, right, and the dysfunctionality of the government in the late 40s and early 50s that paved the way to the military coup in 1952 in the first place, right? I think the same thing can be said as to what happened in the period between 2011 and 2013, that Egypt's civil political forces, despite the success of the 2011 revolution and despite their seeming ability to have been able to work together during the course of the January 25th, 2011 revolution, were completely incapable of coming together to form any kind of sustainable political bargain that all of them would be willing to defend, even if it meant at any particular time it was not in political power. So the military, in both cases, was able to exploit the disarray and the internal divisions within the civilian political elite in Egypt to seize power for itself. Now, that's kind of on the political front. Of course, it helps the military that, unlike the civil political forces, they actually have guns and tanks and such, and so they can force their will on the other members of society. But I think one of the things that we should learn from 2011 is that the military only exercises that kind of power when it thinks the civilian political actors allow it to do so, right? So it was the breakdown of the Mubarak regime that allowed it to intervene. It was the breakdown of the monarchical regime that allowed it to intervene. And it was the breakdown of the Morsi regime that allowed the military to regime. So in each one of these three cases of military intervention, it was the failure of civilian politics that allowed the military to come in, right? So it's not simply the fact that they have guns. So even the army has a requirement to meet some kind of threshold of legitimacy before it can intervene. It needs to be able to justify to other Egyptians and to the world that its intervention is somehow patriotic, is somehow for the interests of society and not for its own narrow corporate interests. In each one of these three cases in Egyptian history, that's all been a consequence, as I said earlier, of the disarray of the civilian political forces themselves. So one might say that if it were conceivable that Egyptian civilian forces could overcome their internal divisions, at least to the extent as to agree to some kind of consensual mechanism of governance, whereby losers would accept the results, for example, then that would lead to a very strong likelihood that Egypt could throw itself off the yoke of military rule. But until that happens, I think it's exceedingly unlikely that we can envision a future without military rule, despite all the problems and even incompetence that the military has displayed in its 70 years of ruling Egypt. And that's kind of on the political front. I think the other interesting problem that the Egyptian military faces in regards to the sustainability of its own rule. So one of the most fundamental problems that any regime faces is that of revenue and how to raise revenue in order to sustain its own power. So the Egyptian military, beginning in the 80s, decided to solve this problem by essentially developing its own economy within the economy of the country. So the military began to act as much as a conglomerate, a business conglomerate, as it was, an institution designed to defend the territorial integrity of the state against internal enemies. So throughout the latter half of the Mubarak period, the military began to acquire various kinds of productive activities in the economy, whether agricultural or industrial or in the communication sector, as a means to raise revenue for itself. During the latter half of the Mubarak regime, this kind of sort of corporate interest of the military, group interest of the military in controlling its own resources by having its own productive capacity, was in tension with the economically liberalizing policies of the Mubarak regime and its attempt to reform the economy and take it toward a more market-oriented direction. One of the outcomes of the 2011 revolution, as we saw, was that there was a great split among Egyptians regarding the political economy of the country. Should it go should it continue marching down the path of economic liberalization, or should it somehow try to reconstitute the Nasserist welfare state that Mubarak had been trying to dismantle slowly over time? From that perspective, many observers believe that the Muslim Brotherhood, under the leadership of Morsi and others, was in an important respect trying to continue Mubarak's legacy, in that they seemed to adopt very market-oriented policies. They wanted to pursue further privatization, further economic liberalization, and economic policies that would dismantle or weaken the Nasserist sort of cradle-to-grave welfare system that he attempted to establish. Now, unsurprisingly, there was a lot of resistance to that, particularly from sectors of society that had a vested interest in the preservation of the state as a kind of redistribution mechanism. I think that's why I think lots of the centers of resistance to the Muslim Brotherhood and Morsi came from the state itself. Because if the program that the Muslim Brothers was proposing, the economic program, was in fact pursued with any kind of rigor and competence, that would have come at the expense of these various interest groups whose livelihoods depended on their relationship to the state. And so for that reason, it was easy for them to make an alliance with the military, and Sisi in particular, insofar as they promised, in some ways, to preserve as much as possible the legacy of Nasser's quasi-socialist enterprise. The problem, I think, that the military is finding, in order to raise resources sufficiently to maintain the loyalty of the various constituencies that back it, it has to get involved. It has to become deeper and deeper, more and more deeply involved in the state's economy. Right. One of the biggest problems facing the state is a totally inadequate fiscal system. Right. The Egyptian state is exceedingly inefficient in its capacity to tax the Egyptian economy. A very large proportion of the Egyptian economy is in the informal sector, maybe even more than half of the economy. So that means, as a practical matter, it's very difficult for the Egyptian state to raise revenue through taxation. As a consequence, in order to raise revenues, you need to actually control assets, right? And so that's what leads the military to expand its commercial activities. The only reliable source of revenue for the military is if it controls wealth-generating assets directly. As a consequence, it's driving out the private sector, right? And so that's causing one kind of contradiction in its coalition, to the extent that private businessmen supported the military in their intervention in 2013. Certainly part of the payoff for them would have been protection of their interests in the economy. Now, the military hasn't confiscated their businesses the way Nasser did in the 1960s in Egypt. But what has happened is that the military is expanding gradually into more and more areas and sectors of the economy, leaving fewer and fewer opportunities for non-military affiliated companies to exploit. So that's creating one serious problem in the coalition that supported Sisi and the military. I think the second problem, and I think this might even be more serious than the first problem, is that the military, by its nature, is not a terribly efficient operation from the perspective of business, right? So they want to seize revenue-generating assets because that's where the money is. Much like a bank robber robs a bank because that's where the money is. So the military wants to get involved in certain businesses because that's where the money is. they're not necessarily the most efficient operators of the asset. In fact, they're probably very poor managers of the asset. And so this gets to the problem of sustainability of the political economy of the military-led regime in Egypt. To the extent that the military needs to seize direct control over the productive assets of the country in order to get enough revenue to satisfy its coalition members, right? Because there is no effective system of taxation. It undermines its future ability to extract revenue because it's a very poor manager of those assets, right? So we're not talking about a kind of rational authoritarian regime that existed in places like Taiwan or South Korea in the 60s and 70s that promoted efficient capitalist development and then extracted surplus revenue through a rational system of taxation. Here you have direct ownership or indirect ownership of productive assets through the military, and oftentimes these assets are very corrupt. Oftentimes these assets are managed very corruptly and very inefficiently because the military puts officers in charge of these assets, and they're appointed largely because of their loyalty to the regime rather than their efficiency and know-how in running the particular business. So, I think that's things right now. You have a short-term problem and a long-term problem. Namely, the short-term problem is that in order for the government or for the state to raise sufficient revenues to sustain itself, it has to take control of the economy directly, which the military is increasingly doing, and that alienates other members of the coalition. And then there's the long-term problem that the military is a very poor manager of these assets, and so we can expect declining returns over time for these assets, which in turn suggests future instability that may come sooner or later, but we know will certainly come because of the rising demands being placed on the state in terms of increased population growth, et cetera, and at the same time matched by declining rates of growth as long as these assets are held by the military, which, as we said, is not necessarily the most efficient manager of these resources. Whether this will lead to some sort of regime crisis in the near future is doubtful. Doubtful only because what we've seen in the last, since 2011, is the extent to which external actors are willing to underwrite the regime through external aid. So in 2013, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Kuwait, I believe, gave the Sisi government an emergency $10 billion loan package. They've subsequently given them other kinds of financial assistance. The IMF came and gave important extensions of credit to the Egyptian government, albeit there was some kind of conditionality involved, which required the government to take some very painful steps, which you would have preferred not to do, but they did do them. Unfortunately for the government, for the state, it hasn't really produced any kinds of, or very minimal kinds of benefit to the economy because removing subsidies is the easiest part, so to speak, of fixing Egypt. The real problem is how do you fix the long-term productivity problems facing the country. That requires investment in the capacity of the population to be more productive. The payoff for that is a lot longer. Unfortunately, for the government, it needs to use the money that it's saved from reducing subsidies to solve other kinds of problems in the short term. So it hasn't been able to reallocate savings from wasteful spending on actual productive investment. So I would expect in the future, there's a great likelihood that we'll see another set of a currency devaluation because fundamentals really haven't changed in any sort of way. So what do I mean by that is normally you would expect after a very substantial devaluation of a country's currency you would expect real exports to increase, you would expect real foreign investment to increase, and that really hasn't taken place. Because many of the reasons for the poor performance of the Egyptian economy in the export sector, or its poor ability to attract foreign investment, have to do with reasons unrelated to exchange rate problems. Sure, the exchange rate was inflated and that deterred foreign investment, that deterred export, but the fundamental problems have to do with lack of competitiveness related to internal problems such as corruption, lack of appropriate infrastructure, lack of appropriate legal regulations, lack of know-how in the workforce, etc. And none of those problems have really been attempted. The government has not really tried to solve any of those problems. So we would expect to see the same fiscal crisis that affected the state prior to 2011 to continue, become more acute, and again perhaps lead to state collapse again. The one reason one hesitates to predict that is the fact that we expect the same group of states, such as Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, to try their best to prevent a fiscal collapse by giving money to Egypt as needed to make sure that they don't. So that's basically my presentation.